Does the government need a spring cleaning? And I give an unequivocal yes to that comment. And we all know there's enormous duplication inside the federal government. GAO has pointed out there's 82 teacher quality programs in 10 different agencies. There's 56 different financial literacy programs across 20 different agencies. So as a new guy, and Jim, you will appreciate this, I thought, well, what we ought to try to do then is consolidate programs. So in my first year in Congress, I thought, well, let's just go after the lowest hanging fruit. Go back and look at the OMB lists of those programs that OMB had identified for termination. And I thought, let's even dig down a little bit deeper, make this less controversial, and let's look at those programs that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration had concurred on so that we could take out partisanship. That accounted for, I believe it was 18 programs, a little over $1 billion a year. I mean, doesn't get rid of a $15 trillion debt, but $1 billion here, $1 billion there, you're talking about real money. And I thought that should be the easiest to do. This is called New Guy Meets Washington. When I found that we could get that kind of an issue through one of those less than substantial amendments to the budget agreement, but never ended up being enacted. So the notion of how you start with program elimination, while not directly at the law issue, is something that we need more work on. Every government agency and department, if you're going to run it in a rational way, can't continue to have 20, 30, 40 top agenda items. If you have that many goals from any management standpoint, that means you have no goals. On that notion of how you clean out the kind of regulatory underbrush, how you try to eliminate regulations that have outlived its usefulness, and how do you try to get into the head of regulators to change the incentives? Right now, within the regulatory framework in our country, there is no incentive for any regulatory agency to go and look back and eliminate. There's only a forward-looking, matter of fact, agencies and regulators are actually incented to add more regulations, because if you add more regulations, that usually results in more staff and more power and more juice. There's no look-back provision. So what we've come up with is a relatively simple concept, although the devil's in the details, of regulatory pay-go. The basic framework being that if you add a new regulation after you do an appropriate cost-benefit analysis and you decide the agency, this is in the public purpose, as you add that regulation, you actually have to take one away of equal size and shape. Now, on a one-for-one basis, it gets a little difficult. We're looking at a slightly varied formula. But what this does is it does put an incentive on the agency, both in drafting the regulation, to think, is there a way you can get 90% of the value for 30% of the cost as opposed to 95% of the value for 100% of the cost, and do this kind of forcing of a trade-off. On the regulatory front, there is never any ex parte post-regulation review of whether a regulation that's put in place actually ever accomplishes its goal. Safety regulation, environmental regulation, you name it, we all kind of conceptually, and I'm not anti-regulatory across the board, I think they play important roles in our society. But there's never a look back that says, did that regulation 3 years after its implementation actually work? You talk about kind of rules-based regulation versus principles-based regulation. Mm-hmm. And again, we've seen the Brits go more on the principles side. We tend to go more on the rules side. I am very sympathetic to a movement that would be more principles-based, that would give regulator more guidelines than the 50 pages of specific regulations. It goes to the heart of our Mr. Howard's comments about the overall legal system. Because we don't really have great data, because we've got regulators over here saying, here's how much X public good there's going to be with no real analysis, and business over here saying, here's the gajillions of cost with no real independent analysis. I've not and I'd welcome from this group, how we kind of rationally get in front of the machine. This is, I think, a terribly important area, and I appreciate the fact of your focus on it. It is long overdue. I think if getting this right, both will help business in terms of global competitiveness, but I also think it can do the right thing for consumers. I think it can do the right thing for folks, people, Americans, making sure that our government is there to, set appropriate rules of the road. The notion of simplification in clarity, I actually think that is a benefit not only to the entity that's being regulated, but the public that's being benefited by that regulatory framework. Trying to have a consumer know what their rights are in a clear way, not buried in 20 pages of fine print, I would argue that is a simplification role that benefits both sides of the ledger. So I don't think we should necessarily be, and I very much believe there's an appropriate, important role for a regulatory structure. I do think the notion that we have a system now that is so over-lawyered in so many ways that it's sometimes can be, I think there is an undue cost of business, but I also think there is not enough benefit. You shouldn't have to hire a lawyer as a consumer to figure out what your rights are.